Okay. Buenos días, React Alicante. Hola. Before I get started, I'd like to say thank you to our sponsors, without whom this event would not be possible. I'm here today to talk to you about everyone's favorite part of web development, forms. I know. Now, forms are hard. Now, why are forms so hard? Well, Form UI is different from the rest of your web application. It's what I call a time of maximum user interaction. And what I mean by that is that during much of the user experience of a web application, the user is pointing and clicking on links and buttons and scrolling. But with forms, it's an entirely different input device. The user is potentially typing several keys per second, and the form needs to be processing all of that data, both to update the field, the value displayed in the field, but also to potentially perform calculations to get a value on another field and to check if the form data is valid. So it's a time of rapid state change. There's a reason that we don't code using the mouse. The keyboard is so much faster. And another complication to Form UI in React is React's unidirectional data flow paradigm. This means that form data must be stored in some central location rather than kept down in the DOM nodes like we used to do in jQuery. And I used to think that React made forms harder, but I've recently changed my mind on that. And to quote the creator of React himself, Jordan Walk, he said, "React exposed the inherent complexity of forms interactions that was already there." So it's not that forms are harder in React than other frameworks. It's that React makes everything else, like showing and hiding divs and animating things across the screen, so much easier that forms just seems harder by comparison. And finally, the last thing that makes forms hard is there's just so much form state. Now, what do I mean by form state? Well, things like what field currently has focus, which fields are dirty, dirty being has the field been changed since it was initialized. Which fields have errors? Which fields has the user visited? Has the user, for a particular field, has the user ever focused on that field and then left that field? We need to know that. Are we currently doing some sort of asynchronous validation? Maybe the user's choosing a username, and before they even finish the sign-up form, we want to go check with a server to see if that username is available. Are we currently submitting? Now that we're submitting everything with Ajax these days, you need to show some sort of a spinner or disable the submit button or something to let people know that something is going on. And have we tried to submit and received some errors from the server? We need to display those somewhere. And then once we display those, we need to, it might be important to know which fields have been changed since we came back with errors from the server, because maybe we don't want to continue to display those error messages. And so managing all of this by yourself with set states in your own component would just be a nightmare. So, okay, everyone says, we get it, forms are hard, but why listen to me? Well, a few years ago, I was starting to build a web application that was going to have quite a few forms that were fairly complicated. And I set out to try and figure out the best way to manage all of that state. And there was no real insight from the industry at this point about how to do this. The React docs just tell you, and this is the way they are, they just tell you how to save your form value in local state and then pass it back as a prop to your input to have a controlled input. That doesn't tell you how to manage a big, complex form. And that was right about the time that Redux came along. And I remember being in the Reactive Flux Slack group where everyone was talking in the React community about these things. And I watched as the creators of Redux, Dan and Andrew, sort of came up with all of the bits that were going to be Redux. And I sent Dan a message. I said, so this Redux thing, is it going to be fast enough for me to dispatch an action on every single key press and have it update the state and then re-render the input? And the answer he gave me was perfect. He said, I don't know, try it. So I did, and I wrote a little reducer to keep track of my form state. And it worked pretty well, and so I open sourced it as a library you may have heard of called Redux Form. And it immediately became clear that Redux Form was scratching an itch that a lot of developers in the community had, because it became adopted quite quickly. And over 3 years, I spent hundreds of hours implementing feature requests and fixing bugs and merging PRs and generally thinking about how to do forms in React and what the best practices are. And the community taught me so much, because let me tell you, there's one thing you learn about open sourcing a bit of code that solved one problem for you, is everyone comes with all their different variations and use cases, and there's such a wide variety of requirements for something as complex as forms. So I got people coming to me and saying, Redux Form is almost perfect for my application, but with one little tweak, if we could just have this config parameter so that later it would not do this when this happened. And so, I said, all right, well, let's add that config parameter because that seems like a reasonable thing. And these things started building and building over time. And Redux Form grew and grew, both in functionality and monthly downloads. It is currently at well over 1 million downloads a month, which still blows my mind. But it also grew in bundle size, because with every little new edge case that someone tacked on to cover their needs, the bundle size for everyone got bigger. And I got some feedback from about Redux Form. You know how the internet is good about giving feedback. First one is, it's only for React. Redux can be used with Angular and other things, and all you really have here is a reducer. Why can't you export that and use it with the Angular community? Also, I have to use Redux because I got a lot of people coming to me saying, I've built my whole web application using some other app state management system, and I need a form solution. And you mean just to get a form solution, I have to install this other app state management library? And also, I got some complaints about why is my form having to re-render every time when parts of my form states that I don't care about are changing. And, of course, it's freaking enormous. It's over 26K gzipped, which is a large library to add to your bundle. All those years of saying, sure, I'll merge your PR for your specific use case, finally took its toll. And the problem with that is that if you're making a simple little login form, you shouldn't have to force your users to download all this complex code for managing complex form structures and arrays and stuff. It's just not the best solution, in my opinion. So I spent many months thinking about all these things, and a solution occurred to me. What if what used to be the reducer, the thing that is taking in all the information and modifying form state, what if the inner engine that managed all the form state was just pure JavaScript? No frameworks, which could make it framework agnostic. You could use it with whatever front-end library you want. It could be Vue or React or whatever is going to be really popular next year. And what if it was subscription-based, where you could specifically tell the engine, I want to be notified when this little bit of the form state changes, and not when anything else changes. Ironically, this is one of the things that Redux does very well, is that when you connect a component to your Redux store, you say, this is the specific slice that I care about of the app state, only re-render me when that changes. So if it could subscribe to things with what is in computer science known as the observer pattern, that would be cool. And also, what if rather than being one big Swiss Army knife that you had to carry around all the time, anytime you wanted to use any one of the tools, what if it was modular and you could pick and choose the little bits of functionality and plug them all together and get a custom solution for your use case? Well, last summer I started working on this, and I released it last fall. It's called Final Form. Final Form is a standalone form state management engine. It's framework agnostic, and it's subscription-based, and It has plugin capabilities with things that I called mutators and decorators that allow arbitrary functionality to be added depending on your use case. And it has 0 dependencies. There's no Lodash, there's no TypeScript helper things, there's no nothing. It's just pure JavaScript. That's the bundle that you get. And the entire form engine is only 4.3K gzipped. And because I'm a React nerd, it comes with a companion library called React Final Form. But it's super simple. All React Final Form are React bindings for Final Form. It maps the form and field state to render props. It handles React synthetic events to get the data back into the form engine. And it's even smaller. It's only 3.1K gzipped. So Final Form and React Final Form together provide a total React form solution for only 7.4K gzipped. So let's see how that compares to the other popular libraries. There's Redux Form is up there, enormous. Formic is quite a bit smaller, and React Final Form and Final Form together are even smaller. I'd never heard of this informed library, but when I was doing research to put this slide together, I discovered it, and it looks pretty cool, but doesn't quite seem to be at feature parity with the other big players, so I imagine it's going to grow a little bit in the future. So if bundle size is important to you, and it should be, it's a factor when choosing a form library. So let me do a quick overview of the React Final Form API. It's really simple. There are 3 components. There's form, which wraps your entire form and provides form states to a render prop. There's field, which registers a field in the containing form and provides field state and callback functions to a render prop. The callback functions being things like onChange and onBlur and onFocus that you have to give to your actual input. And then there's FormSpy. FormSpy provides a way to read form state within your form without re-rendering the entire form. Now, that's an amazing sentence that I'm very proud of. And it won't be immediately obvious to you what that means, but I will get to it shortly. So, enough reading the docs. Let's jump into some live coding. Let's see if I can. Maybe about that size. Okay. Is that font okay? Okay, so this is just a simple React. I moved the laptop. I did this last year too. Okay. This is just a simple React component here that is that's hot reloading. If I change something over here and I come over here, it hot reloads, which, if you ask me, is the only way to code. So let's build a form. So first we need to import form, and field from React Final Form. And we'll come down here and we'll create our form. Now, the only prop that form requires is on submit, and that function to handle your form values when the submit happens. And I have this function here that all it does for demo purposes is it waits half a second and then alerts up your values. And the form, you can either provide a render prop as an actual prop called render, but lately I'm much more a fan of the render prop as child design paradigm here. So one of the things it gives you is a handle submit function, which is designed to be given directly to your HTML forms on submit. So now we have a form here. Let's put in a field. So we'll make our little row. We'll make a label. We'll call it first name. And here we're going to put our field. And field requires a name. And you can either give it like the form, you can give it a render prop as a render prop, or you can give it a render prop as a child, or you can give it some other component, a React component, that is a React component, or you can give it a string that is either input or text area or select, the standard HTML components, input components. All right, so we save, and now we have a field that we can type in. Great. I personally am a big fan of using placeholder. I think it makes the forms a lot easier to use. All right, so we need a submit button, obviously. All right, so now when I type something in here and I hit submit, it waits a half a second and it alerts. Okay? So it's kind of a small form, so let's add some more fields. And we'll do last name. Last. And I don't know, we'll say, yep, email. All right, so now we have 3 fields. You got our and everything works here. I think spell my name. And you hit submit, and it works. But every good form has some validation. So how do we do client-side validation? Well, there's 2. Hold on, one other thing we can do. So this form component here is giving us lots of form state. There's things like dirty and pristine, and also you can get all of your values, and you can get like, are you currently submitting? So let's go down here and let's disable the submit button when we're submitting. That's all you have to do. And just for demo purposes down here, let's print out the values so we can see them change in real time. Values. So now, as we type here, we can see the values changing down there. And when we hit submit, notice the submit button gets disabled. All right, so back to our validation. You can either, there's 2 ways to do it. You can either run, you can either get past what I call a record level validation function here that takes all your values and gives back an object that has the same shape as your values. If you've ever used Redux Form, this is going to be very familiar to you. So for example, if there was an error with first name, under the key first name would be the error for first name. And I really like that method because, especially if you're using Node on the back end, you can actually share that function on your client side and on the back end. So when your back end receives your JSON, it can go and run that validation. Normally, that's not going to be a big deal, but because you're not going to be able to submit from your form to the server. But it could be a security risk where someone could potentially spoof some request and give you invalid data. But for this demo, we're going to use what I call field level validation, and that is giving a validate function here. And that's just one that takes a value, and if it's valid, it returns undefined. Otherwise, it returns the error message. So, like if the value is truthy here, we're going to say undefined, otherwise required. Okay. So now, first name is required. So if I try and hit submit, nothing happens because my form is invalid and it's not going to do the submit. But as soon as I type something in here, now it will. But this is a terrible user experience because we're not displaying the error message anywhere. So let's go ahead and make our other fields required as well. And for that, I'm going to save this function here, like so, and then we can just pass that function. Required. Let me come down to here. If you're not coding with running prettier on every save, you're insane. That prettier has changed the game in JavaScript. Okay, so now all of our fields are required. So we need to figure out how to display our error message. So the error message is in our field state. I mean, it's also in our form state, but it's in our field state. So we somehow have to get the value out of our field state. So let's figure out how to do that. But we can't get the value if we're using this component equals input shortcut. So we can't do that. We're going to have to use a render prop. And render prop is going to be given our field state. And for now, let's just print it out like we're doing with our values down there. Stringify. And okay, so this is all of our field state for first name. Now, if you use Redux Form, this is going to be pretty familiar to you. It's divided into two parts, two main parts. You've got the input, which is all the stuff that you have to give to your actual input component to make it work, to give it the values. So this has things like the name, the value, and what Stringify doesn't print out is some callback functions like onBlur and onFocus and onChange that get your data back into final form. And then it has this meta section. And meta is all the state management that final form is giving you. So it has active, whether or not the field is currently focused. You've got dirty, which is, it has it changed since it was initialized. You've got error. There's our error. So now we know where to get our error from. It's under meta.error. And of course, invalid is true because we have an error. Pristine is just the opposite of dirty. Both are provided to make your code a little bit more readable. And valid is the opposite of invalid, of course. And then we have these two things called touched and visited. And these are terms that I came up with when I was doing Redux Form. Visited means, has the user ever focused on your field? Once the user has focused on your field, then it has just true for the lifetime of the form until it gets reset. Touched is, has the user focused on the field and then left the field? And that's very useful for displaying error messages, which you will see shortly. And then down here, you've got any other props that aren't part of the field API that have been passed to field. So, whatever you put in here is going to show up here in your field state. So that's very useful for if you need to pass config parameters to some custom input widget. So let's where's our whatever there? So let's use this field state here and build a better field here. So field state is composed mainly, we're going to destructure these guys. We've got input and meta, and we've got our placeholder here. And rather than print it out, we're going to, let's just do the whole row. So do the whole div, label, first name. And then here, rather than how we had field before, we're going to put our input. And this is where having all the input stuff in its own little object is super cool, because all you have to do is spread that guy out there, and now the input is connected. It's going to work. We also have our placeholder that we want to pass. Okay, so now we can go up here and get rid of this first row. And we hold our breath and we save. And we still have our field here, and it works. But we don't have our error message yet. We're not printing it out. So remember, the error message is here in this meta thing. So code high? Okay. Thank you. Our meta is up here in meta.error. So if we have a meta error, then we'll print it out. Okay, so now we have our error message here, but it's a little too aggressive, in my opinion, to immediately yell at your user when they first come in to try and start using your form. So that's why we have this touched property that works a lot better. So if meta and meta.touched. Now the form looks nice and pristine, and when the user comes into your field and doesn't do what they need to do, then when they tab out of it, then the error appears and they know to have to come back and fix it. So now we have this structure, so let's go and replace our other two fields down there with this. So first name, last name, and this was email. So now we can get rid of our rows down here. All right, so now as we tab through our form, it's going to start complaining to us that that we're passing required fields. And in real time, as we type, the errors are going to go away. And the other nice thing about this is Final Form by default, and Redux Form did this too, if you submit and the submit fails because you have validation errors, it's going to mark all your fields as touched. So what the user experience is they hit submit, and then all the errors appear if they just scroll down and hit submit for some reason. But we can do other stuff with our field state. So remember in our meta we had active. So we can do stuff like let's put a class name on our whole row when that field is active. Active. And I'm going to replace these other divs down here with that. So now, when I focus on my field, it's all nicely highlighted. And this is good user experience because it draws the user's eyes to the field that they're supposed to be concerned with. And also you can put little tooltip helpers to explain more about what the current thing that you're trying to do should be. All right, so this is a very common way to build forms in React. Your form looks like this when you do it in Redux Form and Formic and React Final Form. It all sort of looks like this. You might be concerned, because this happens to us developers, you might see that we have all this repeated code here, like all this logic to display the error and the logic to style it. You can refactor those out into different little specialized components, or you could take this out into a separate function. But I kind of like, one of the reasons that I like the child as render prop structure is that you get this, I can see what the actual document structure looks like when I look at this. You've got a form, and then I know I have a div with a label and an input, and then I've got another div with a label and an input. So I would caution on trying to avoid refactoring things like this, if you can. So, as I said, this is what libraries look like when you. This is what forms look like with most libraries. But now we want to look into what sets Final Form apart. What's special about it, and that's the subscription observer pattern. So, to demo that, I have this little tool. Called render count, and all render count does is it prints out how many times it itself has been rendered. So we're going to throw it on each of our rows here, and we lost our styles. So see this little circle here. This one up at the corner is how many times the form itself has been re-rendered, and each of these correspond to each of their fields. So as I type in the form, you will notice that the whole form is re-rendering, as are all of the fields. So what we can do with subscriptions is we can minimize that. So what we can do is, to our field component, we can provide a subscription. And here we can choose sort of a la carte what parts of the field state that we want to be notified about. So let's look at what we're rendering here. Obviously we need value because we're rendering because we have to render the input and show the value. And then we're also using active and error and touched. So we have to specify those. True, touched, true. So now, this field, let's go ahead and copy this for all of our fields, because they're all the same. Okay, so now our fields are only going to render when those things change. So when we go over here and type in our field, what happens? Well, it's doing the same thing. It's all still rendering the whole form and all the fields. And that's because it has to re-render the entire form because the values are changing, and we're printing out the values here. And when the whole form re-renders, it's going to call the render function on all of those fields as well. So we need to do the same thing on form and only subscribe to the parts of the form state that we care about. So here, what are the form things that we're using? We're using values and submitting. So now, when we type in here, well, it's got a little bit better, but it's still re-rendering the whole form every time, and that's because you can't. Every time on every key press, the values change, so we can't subscribe to values up here. So if we remove the values subscription, now watch what happens. I focus on the first field, and as I type in here, only that field re-rendered. The whole form is still only rendered only one time. So as I type in here, it's only re-rendering the exact parts of the field and state that we care about. But we lost values down here. And obviously on a regular form, you're not going to print out all your values, but there might be times when you need parts of your form state to display somewhere, like which fields have errors and things like that. So what we need to do is we need to render some form states without re-rendering the entire form, which, as you may recall, was that bizarre sentence before from FormSpy. That's what FormSpy does. So down here where we're rendering out our JSON, we do FormSpy, we subscribe only to values, which gives us a render function that has the values. And then we can print out our JSON. And just for fun, let's put a render count guy in here so we can see. Okay, so now, as I type in one of my fields, watch what happens. Each field re-renders one time for every time that the field state is changed. And the whole form is only rendered once, but this thing down here, the FormSpy, is rendering on every value change. But it's not rendering when, like, I take away focus from this field. It doesn't have to re-render because it doesn't care. It's not subscribed to which field is active. Okay, so that's now. This is not that important. I want to stress that very, very much. For almost all of your forms, if you have 10 or 20 fields in them, it's not going to matter if the whole thing re-renders on every single key press. But I have spoken to some poor React developers that have requirements that they have like 50 or 100 or 200 fields on their form, and when it gets that big, it can start to lag on slower devices. So that's why, from the ground up, Final Form was built with this potential performance tweak, but by default, it subscribes you to all the changes, and it's just going to work. You don't have to think about this until you do, and when you have that need, you're going to be glad that you have this ability. So let's remove all our render counts here, because they're distracting. And now let me show you a little bit about the plugin capabilities. So a very common feature request that I get is my users are trying to fill out this really long form, and they scroll down to the bottom and they hit submit, and it doesn't submit. So the submit has marked all of the fields as touched, which is causing the error messages to display, but some of the error messages are off screen, and most users are just confused and say, this doesn't work. The slightly smarter users will actually go and look and try and figure out where the error is and complete the submission. But wouldn't it be nice if you could automatically scroll up to where the first error is and maybe even focus on that field? Well, so in React, if you were going to implement this, you'd have to come down here to focus on a field. You have to actually have a reference to the DOM node and call the focus function on it. So to do that, for each of your inputs, you'd have to come in here and like save a ref to the DOM node in some map from field name to the DOM ref. And then once your submission failed, you'd have to go and look at all your errors and find the first one and look up that DOM node and call focus on it. But that's one thing that comes with Final Form already implemented. So watch how difficult this is to do. There's a decorator called Final Form Focus. And to install it, I create an instance of it, and I come down here to my form, and I pass it as a prop to decorators. Decorators takes an array of however many decorators you want to use. So I save that I add that to my form, and now my form automatically gains this feature. So now when I come over here and I hit submit, boom, it focuses on the first field where the first error is and draws the user's attention to it, and it has a side benefit of as you fill it out, if you hit return, that's going to submit your form. But what it really does is it submits your form and then highlights the next field with an error. So there's several different libraries that I've written out there that can sort of plug and play with Final Form. And again, the important thing is maybe your form doesn't need this. For a login form or something, you don't need to go and focus necessarily on the field with the error. But the fact that that you can pick and choose functionality to plug into your form to make it more powerful is very useful. And there's other ones that will use the HTML5 validation API. So that will display browser native validation errors as you're going through your form, which is great for accessibility because screen readers know what to do with that because it's part of the spec. And also, if you were unfortunate enough to have the requirement that your form work with JavaScript disabled, please no, never again. Then you can actually have client-side validation with JavaScript disabled with that HTML5 validity API. So that's a little example of how to build forms and what Final Form allows you to do with them. So let me switch back to the presentation here. That is what you should see. Okay, we survived our live coding. I want to talk briefly about how to pick a form library, how to pick any library, really. You need to look at, does it have the functionality that you need with your current requirements? And like, when you read the Getting Started section, does that make sense? And also, does it look extensible? Does it look like it's going to also manage your future requirements? Because even though you have pretty small requirements now, maybe in the future you're going to have other edge cases and stuff. And it's good to see if it looks like a library is going to be able to manage that for you. And one good way to know that is by how many examples are in the documentation. There are many, many things that I love about Next.js. But one of the biggest ones is the examples directory in the repo. For every single companion technology that you can think of, like all the Node web servers like Express and Koa and Happy, or all the CSS and JS libraries like Glamour and Styled Components and Emotion, and all the state management libraries like Redux and Apollo and Unstated and Redux Saga and all that stuff, for every single one of those, there is a directory in there that shows you how to use this with Next.js. And when choosing a server-side rendering library, that gives me a lot of confidence that no matter how my requirements change in the future, Next is going to be there and it's going to be flexible enough to accommodate any of those changes. And similarly, React Final Form currently has 34 different examples accommodating many common use cases. Now, these are use cases that I learned about maintaining Redux Form for 3 years, where I got, remember how I said that when you open source something, everyone comes with all your different requirements. I learned all of these different things that that the community needs to do with forms. And it's partly how I battle tested Final Form, is I made sure that it could handle all of those use cases, and it even does a few more that Redux Form cannot. So that's important. Does the repo look well maintained? Now, any sufficiently popular library is going to have a bazillion issues on it, and no maintainer is going to be able to really keep all of those issues down. But if you look at how many open PRs a library has on GitHub, because PRs are a lot harder to do because you actually have to put in the work, and if a library looks like it has a bunch of old stale PRs that haven't been responded to or merged, that's probably a sign that the maintainers are not paying much attention to it. And I speak from experience because I have repos that I'm not paying enough attention to, and there are many PRs that I need to actually get to. And another thing is code coverage. For the past 2 years, I guess since I released the version 6 of Redux Form, I've made it my open source policy to never release anything or any feature upgrades that don't have 100% code coverage. And this 100% coverage does not guarantee that there are no bugs, but I can guarantee you that if you try and implement 100% code coverage, you will find bugs, because there are edge cases and things that you just haven't considered. But once you get tests that run through every single line of your code, it's going to be better for it. So I feel confident in saying that a library with 100% coverage is probably, on average, going to have fewer bugs than one that doesn't. And then there's bundle size, which I mentioned before. It's important, but it's not everything. So if you've got two libraries that more or less look the same to you, you should choose the one with the smaller bundle size if that's your last variable that you've come down to. And your users will appreciate it. But probably the most important thing is, does the library make sense to you? Do you understand what it's doing, and does it jibe with the way that you think and the way that you code? That's very important. So I'd like to leave you today from one more tweet quote from probably the most influential thought leader in the React community. I know who you're thinking of. Form library authors are like anesthesiologists. They help people feel a little bit better when enduring an excruciating experience. As I started at the beginning, forms suck. But the reason to use a form library is that it handles so much of the state management drudgery for you, making it faster and easier to build forms so that you can get on to building the fun parts of your application. Thank you. Any questions? And if you want to come find me later, que también hablo castellano, así que.
Yeah, hello.
Yes.
I really love Redux Form and Final Form. It's great libraries, but in Redux Form we had fields for subscribe to multiple fields at form, and in Final Form there is no fields. Why?
You're talking about the fields component that gets you state from multiple fields? Yes, that is true. That was something that I consciously chose not to implement, but it is very implementable. I could do that in the future, and if I did, it would be one of these side plugin libraries that doesn't require everyone to have it, but it is definitely something that could be implemented, and I should, especially if I hear more people telling me that they miss it. So, thank you.
One more? Okay, that's it. Thank you, Erik.
The one obvious question that I was hoping someone would ask is, should I migrate from Redux Form to Final Form? And the answer to that question is, I think this is a better way to do things. But Redux Form does still have its place if you really need tight coupling with your form data with Redux. If you need to be modifying it through dispatching actions from somewhere else, then you should stay with Redux Form. But the migration, I was going to write a migration guide, but it's just so easy that I didn't get around to it. So anyway, thank you.